All right, we are sitting here in Panama, and we had sailed from Bonaire around Curacao and Aruba all the way to Panama. And a lot of anxiety had built up among some of the sailors here in Bonaire about the upcoming trip and how to do it well. And so, while by no means an expert in any way about sailing or about how to make this transit, I thought it might be useful to go through some of our thoughts and how we made it and give some guidance just to the resources that exist out there for other sailors thinking about the same trip. The first thing we did is just tried to dissect what the trip was, and we came to the conclusion there's really two trips that are separate from each other. The first trip is here from Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, around the Cape, and then down and around to Cartagena. That's trip one, and then trip two is really from Cartagena on down to where we're going to go in Panama, San Blas, or Colon. And so, as you can see here, the main difference between the two trips is one's a big deal and the other is just motoring. So there's two trips, and the only one to really concern yourself with, or at least for us, was this first section. The first thing I tried to do was avail myself of a lot of good stuff on the internet of folks who've done the trip as well. You can see here flying across the sea. They talk about it being the fifth most dangerous crossing in the world, and they come up with some strategy, and really several different strategies come to light. Stay offshore versus stay inshore, etc. There's cruising the coast of Colombia by Caribbean Compass. It's a really good article from Pizzazz. And then, of course, if you go and you look at Totem, they've got several great articles on how they went about it. Good thinking and dissecting, and then in retrospect, looking at what they did in their transit. And then the second thing I tried to do was talk to a weather router. Most people know Chris Parker. He's very good. I also like Commanders and a couple others. They'll spend a lot of time with you, and that's, I think, very, very useful. But the way I went about it first was to try and find the thing that was the most concerning for me in the whole transit, and that turned out to be the Rio Magdalena in Colombia, which drains an enormous amount of Colombia. It's 7,200 cubic meters per second, and it seems like that when you're crossing it because it's just like sailing through a chocolate yoo-hoo. And it's long, it's 1,500 kilometers long, draining more than half of Colombia. And that enters right there on your way, and you're going to have to cross it. So that, to me, because it has a lot of debris in the water, it's got trees and snakes and all kinds of boards and detritus, school buses, houses, everything could get washed down and out, and impoverished Colombia does. And you're going to be steering your way through it. And you certainly don't want to be steering at night or during a difficult time. And so that became our number one determinant in trying to find the right time to pass the Rio Magdalena. We came to the conclusion of sailing west, and we certainly don't want the sun in our eyes, so high noon was the best time to do that. So from that point, we simply back calculated. Here's where it comes in, the Rio Magdalena does right in here. We just back calculated how much time based on our sailing speed. We cover about 100 miles in 12 hours. And so that determined our starting point to be somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning from southern Bonaire. We cover about 100 miles getting from southern Bonaire up here to Aruba, another 100 miles to Cabo de la Vela. We come around the point, that's probably a little more than 100 miles here in the concave section here between the Cabo de la Vela and Santa Marta, and then about a 6-hour crossing coming down here and going from Santa Marta and the headlands there down to the crossing at Barranquilla. The additional thing we wanted to do is not pass any of these headlands, which are very notorious for generating high winds. Anytime you have a convexity like this, or up here in Cabo de la Vela, or at the headlands of Venezuela or Colombia, you're going to have a building of wind. And so we didn't want to necessarily cross these times with, or these areas at the time where the wind is at its strongest, which we had a little reprieve at this time of year, and it was May, during the early morning from around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning up to around maybe 8 o'clock in the morning. So we timed it to cross the Santa Marta, which is arguably the highest compression, simply because you have Cristobal or Pico Cristobal Colon here, which is, you can see, is a massive mountain, 18,500 feet. That's like 4,000 feet higher than Denali. And so the winds come through all those trades and get compressed by the headlands here, and then again by this massive conclusion of the chain of the Andes as it comes down to the shore. The other thing we didn't want to do is we didn't want to cross this point during the late afternoon or early evenings, where you get the katabatic winds that are trundling down the mountainside as the day cools. That results in about 60 to 70 knot winds blowing down and into these fjords here and into the headlands of Santa Marta. So based on that, we figured a noontime crossing. If we went 6 hours back, that would be about 6 o'clock in the morning to Santa Marta headlands, which is perfect. It's nice and calm then. And then we dialed it back, and we'd be in here sometime in the late evening, early morning at the Cabo de la Vela. And then came back for a starting point here at Bonaire about 3 o'clock in the morning. Additionally, we used weather routing, and better, honestly, than the weather routers was our use of Predict Wind. And we subscribe to their package, and does weather routing for you. But what we looked at specifically was the gust and the wind speeds at the times that we would be crossing these capes. And this is kind of determined which day. We knew what time we'd be leaving, but we didn't know which day. And so we ran these models, and kind of, as you can see, you'll see an increase in wind speed, and sometimes it's a little lower in wind speed. And that allowed us to really, at these two cruxes, Cabo de la Vela and Santa Marta headlands, to kind of determine we wanted less red and more orange or green if possible. And when we were leaving, it was really more, it was more orange and maybe even a little brown. But that's what it was all the time. And as you can see, as we run these models, if you come down, you see the intertropical convergence zone here. It really starts there, and then it just heads south. So sometimes that gets pushed up a little bit and kind of comes down. You can kind of see some diurnal variation in that as well. But also we looked at, just tried to pick a time where we set out we'd have lower winds as we cross these two critical compression points. And that was the use of Predict Wind. Additionally, even more than the wind state is the wave state. And we tried to do the same, noting that the waves would follow the wind by about 12 to 24 hours. And so that was really important, just trying to avoid that orange and yellow, 3 to 5 meters right in here and in here. Rain is not as much an issue, but the wind and, of course, the waves. Another useful feature of Predict Wind is the gust. That tells you what you're going to be expecting in terms of peak winds. And then the CAPE, which essentially tells you the energy in the environment and atmosphere at that time. And that predicts a lot of thunderstorms and convection that comes off the coast. And so if you can go at a low convection time, a low energy time, that'll decrease your probability of running into afternoon thunderstorms that come down from the mountains of Colombia. So based on our single most important determinant, that being the Rio Magdalena, we back calculated, and then we looked at the weather to try and determine a good date. We talked to our weather routers and see if they'd agreed. Actually, one weather router was very distracted, and I really disagreed with him. And then that's what prompted our call to our second weather router, who also disagreed with the first weather router completely. And we actually went with the second weather router's advice, and I think that was the exact right thing to do. The first weather router had us going really in peak winds, and that would not have worked out. So if something doesn't make sense to you, of course, really think it through. Then the question is, how does the weather change over the model run? And sometimes you just simply don't have a way to control things. You can slow down. You certainly can't speed up. But the weather can change, what's going to be happening at these points of intercept. And so that's going to be important, just running the model and just playing with it back and forth. Another thing that we used is the table version of Predict Wind. You can see if you run these different models, and you can do it for different days, different hours, etc. You'll see there's quite a bit of difference in how the passages look in terms of wind speed, percentage of downwind running, your percentage of wind speed in terms of knots, and then also times of wave heights. And sometimes it'll be, have 4 to 5 meter waves, and then, wait 3 or 4 days, it might be into 1 to 2 meter waves. And this table version really puts it in a very digestible format. Then lastly, we just did research on what we're going to be going by and looking at the Google Earth. One of the things that we noted was if you look at the way the Caribbean's designed, and it really actually comes better if you look at a chart like Navionics like this, you see all these deep areas of 3,000 to 4,000 meters, and that's what actually makes for some great diving in Bonaire and Curacao. Is that all that cold deep water comes up and bathes the reef? But as it marches on and the waves march on and the heights diminish just west of Aruba, you see they drop from the 4,000s to the 200s. And then you get into like 160 to 197. That's for every drop in depth, there's an increase in wave height and a big amount of compression of wave in this area. So that influenced our decision to kind of enjoy the lee of Aruba and then come up and go around and get off the continental shelf of South America into the 1,000 to 2,000s, and then just that kept the wave height much lower, and then dive down around the lee of the headlands of Columbia and around Cabo de la Vela. And then we enjoyed a really just peaceful night right in this Selkis here of the Colombian coast here before we hit Santa Marta in the early morning. But that's how we broke it down. We essentially left at 3 o'clock in the morning. We sailed in the lee of Bonaire, and winds and waves picked up a little bit as we reached Curacao. Sun up here. Again, enjoyed the lee of Curacao in terms of sea state, but wind was good. Came up here and then crossed, and again, wind and waves building as we came to the southern tip of Aruba in the afternoon. And then went through the lee of Aruba, and then in the evening came out and went around the headlands of Columbia, enjoying deep water, and then tucked in early morning and sailed all the way down here the whole day, and then came around Santa Marta early in the morning to avoid those katabatic winds, and also to avoid the thunderstorms, and also to avoid the higher wind speeds that you see in the afternoon and early evenings. And then came across Rio Magdalena. We hit it around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, had our girls sit up on the bow. We saw a fence post and telephone poles, etc. And then we came around, and by the time we made it to down to Cartagena, things were over. We just essentially had to motor all the way to Panama. It was a great trip. Thanks so much. Hopefully this helps.